Picture this. You're 18, broke, and someone offers you steady pay, 3 meals a day, and job security for life. Sounds great, right? Now imagine the recruiter forgot to mention that those 3 meals consist of rock-hard crackers, wine so sour it's basically vinegar with commitment issues, and mystery meat that may or may not have had a name last week. Oh, and that job security? It comes with a 20 to 25-year contract that you can't break without facing execution for desertion. You'll discover how signing a small lead tablet and saying a few words changed more than your clothing. It rewired your legal status, daily routine, and personal freedom. Still interested in that signing bonus? Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The moment you step through that tent flap, you're entering a carefully orchestrated trap disguised as opportunity. You walk in thinking you're just exploring your options, maybe getting some information about this whole Roman army thing. The recruiter seems friendly enough, asking about your background, checking your physique, making small talk about your clean criminal record. He nods approvingly at your height, tests your grip strength, and asks some oddly specific questions that make you wonder what exactly you're signing up for. Then comes the probatio. Suddenly you're being examined, like livestock, at a county fair. The recruiter pokes your muscles, checks your teeth for disease, and inspects your feet for flat arches, like he's buying a horse. You're standing there in your underwear while strangers debate whether your body meets Roman military standards. This feels less like a career consultation and more like a very awkward medical exam conducted by people who've never heard of patient privacy. They record your name, any distinguishing marks, and catalog every detail about your physical appearance with the efficiency of a warehouse inventory system. Before you know it, you're swearing a military oath that sounds suspiciously permanent. The words flow out in formal Latin that you barely understand, but the general gist seems to be you pledging your life, your soul, and probably your firstborn to the Roman Empire. You try to ask for clarification, but everyone's looking at you expectantly, and you don't want to seem stupid, so you just nod along like you totally meant to sign away your entire existence. They hand you a small lead tablet called a signaculum to wear around your neck, your new ID that functions like ancient dog tags, listing your name, unit assignment, and the date you officially stopped being a free citizen. It's about the size of a modern credit card, but infinitely more binding. You can't cancel the subscription, and there's definitely no free trial period. The moment you take that oath, you've crossed from civilian to soldier, and desertion becomes punishable by death. You realize this wasn't a job interview at all. This was a legal transformation with your own enthusiastic consent. The recruiter explains cheerfully that leaving without permission is considered treason, and military discipline for serious offenses can be fatal. You've essentially just volunteered for house arrest, except the house is the entire Roman Empire and the guards carry swords. You're given viaticum, road money for the journey to your unit. Sometimes you have to hand it over to an escorting officer who manages travel expenses for the group. The coins feel heavy in your palm, and suddenly the recruiter's friendly demeanor shifts to something more businesslike. He's not talking to a potential recruit anymore. He's addressing government property. Your civilian clothes get packed away in a bundle that feels suspiciously like evidence from a crime scene. You understand that putting on that uniform isn't just a costume change. It's a legal transformation from citizen to soldier, from individual to component. The fabric feels rough against your skin, but it's the symbolic weight that really gets to you. You've just traded civil law for military obedience, and the walk to your first camp feels less like starting a new job and more like a funeral march for your former life. Each step takes you further from everything you used to be, toward whatever passes for home in this new existence. The camp gates close behind you, and suddenly you're face to face with your new living situation. You arrive expecting maybe a barracks room, perhaps a small bed, basic human accommodations. Instead, you're introduced to your contubernium, the 8-man tent group that serves as your basic sleeping and meal unit. 7 other men who will share your tent, your meals, and unfortunately, your personal space for the foreseeable future. The officer making introductions speaks like he's presenting you with a wonderful gift rather than sentencing you to communal living hell. The tent that's supposed to house 8 grown men is roughly the size of a modern walk-in closet. In permanent camps, barrack blocks offered small rooms of about 50 square feet for pairs of soldiers, but out here in the field, your contubernium shares this canvas prison. You stand there doing the math, trying to figure out how 8 adult bodies are supposed to fit in a space that would be cramped for 4. The previous occupants have left their mark in ways that assault multiple senses simultaneously. Your new bunkmates create a symphony of human dysfunction. Marcus snores like a dying walrus having an existential crisis, while Gaius treats his sandals like they're permanently attached to his unwashed feet. The air inside becomes so thick with a combination of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and leather that's seen better decades that you could practically chew it. Everyone's personal hygiene standards are flexible, which is a polite way of saying non-existent. Privacy becomes a foreign concept when you're sharing sleeping space so cramped that rolling over requires a group consensus. Someone always has an elbow in your ribs or a foot in your face. Personal belongings get mixed up constantly because there's literally nowhere to store anything privately. Daily arguments erupt over whose tunic is whose belt belongs to whom, and who took someone else's spare sandals. Everything looks identical after a few weeks of use, and Roman military gear doesn't come with name tags. Bathroom breaks require coordination, because leaving the tent at night means disturbing everyone. The communal latrines offer no privacy, just a long bench with holes where you sit next to strangers handling their business, sharing the communal sponge on a stick. The smell carries for hundreds of yards, serving as an early warning system for the uninitiated. This enforced proximity isn't accidental. The cramped conditions systematically break down your civilian identity, making you dependent on this small group while severing ties to your old life. Desertion becomes not just legally dangerous, but socially impossible when these men know your every movement, habit, and weakness. You realize that military camaraderie isn't about brotherhood. It's about survival when you can't escape each other even for 5 minutes. The concept of personal space becomes as mythical as the idea that this military service will be glamorous. These men become your closest companions not through choice, but through sheer proximity and shared misery. After your first night in this canvas nightmare, you wake up wondering what other promises the recruiter might have stretched. Starting with that guarantee about 3 meals a day, you sit down for your first military meal expecting something resembling actual food, maybe even something warm. The cook hands you buxelatum, hardtack so tough it could double as armor plating. This stuff was designed to last for years without spoiling, which explains why it has the texture of compressed sawdust and makes a sound when you tap it against the table. Not a pleasant sound, more like knocking on a door made of regret. The wine has been diluted with water and gone sour during transport, creating a drink that tastes suspiciously like disappointment with vinegar undertones. You ask what kind of animal provided the meat in your stew, and the cook gives you the same look your tent mates gave you when you suggested personal hygiene standards. The vegetables are whatever didn't rot during the last supply run, which means they're technically edible in the same way that tree bark is technically edible if you're desperate enough. Garum gets poured on everything. This fermented fish sauce creates a smell that follows you around like a persistent, fishy ghost that's taken a personal interest in your suffering. The Romans put this stuff on bread, meat, vegetables, and probably their sandals if they could figure out how to make it stick. It's the kind of smell that clings to your clothes, your hair, and your soul until you forget what fresh air smells like. When you're marching through hostile territory, your contubernium carries a small hand mill for grinding grain, because the alternative is trying to chew wheat kernels like some kind of human horse. You spend your precious free time grinding grain into flour for coarse porridge or hard cakes when fresh food runs out. The grinding makes a sound that haunts your dreams, assuming you get any sleep between the 17 minutes of free time you have each day. The army plans supply stockpiles and relies heavily on foraging parties, but losing a supply train means potential starvation for entire forces. When pack mules die, which happens regularly, you face a choice between questionable meat or nothing at all. Supply failures turn meals into survival exercises, where you learn to identify which berries won't kill you immediately and which small animals are too fast to catch with your bare hands. Water quality varies from questionable to definitely contaminated, but you drink whatever's available because dehydration kills faster than whatever's swimming in that stream. Sometimes you're forced to drink water that could cause sickness, but the choice between potential illness and certain death from thirst isn't really a choice at all. You develop a sophisticated palate for distinguishing between water that might kill you and water that will definitely kill. You discover that constant poor food undermines both morale and physical performance, turning your legendary Roman warrior fantasy into a daily struggle with malnutrition. Your standards for delicious plummetu doesn't actively fight back when I chew it, and that gray mystery meat starts looking appetizing after you've been marching for 12 hours on an empty stomach. The promise of 3 meals a day gets technically fulfilled, though meal is doing some serious heavy lifting in that description. But at least you're getting fed regularly, which is more than you can say about the gear they're about to strap onto your increasingly malnourished body. Getting fitted for your gear feels exciting at first. You're about to become a legendary Roman warrior, right? The armorer approaches with what looks like actual military equipment, and for a moment you feel like you're stepping into history. Then they start loading you up with just under 60 pounds of equipment that turns walking into an endurance sport and breathing into a luxury you can't quite afford anymore. Your lorica segmentata looks impressive hanging on the rack, all those gleaming iron plates arranged in perfect rows. The armor itself weighs about 12 to 15 pounds, but it fits like it was designed by someone who'd never seen a human body, just heard one described by a drunk person in poor lighting. The joints pinch in places you didn't know could be pinched, and the plates shift at exactly the wrong moments, usually when you're trying to do something important like breathe or move your arms. The caligae, those famous Roman sandals, need perfect fitting or your feet will be hamburger after the first long march. Perfect fit isn't always available in your size though, because Roman logistics apparently didn't account for the vast diversity of human foot shapes. The leather straps dig into your ankles, and while the hobnails provide excellent traction on dirt and grass, they turn you into a skating disaster on any paved surface. The edges haven't been properly beveled, which means blisters start forming before you've walked 50 yards. Your helmet requires careful padding to prevent concussion, but too much padding means it doesn't fit properly, and too little means every bump rattles your brain like dice in a cup. The weight sits wrong on your neck, creating a constant ache that radiates down your spine. Long service noticeably thickened veterans' necks from supporting this weight for years, assuming their vertebrae didn't give out first. The shield's weight and curvature create constant strain on your arm that never quite goes away. Maintaining its wax coating becomes a daily chore that determines whether you live or die in battle, because a neglected shield means the colors fade and the wood deteriorates. The thing measures about 3 feet wide and nearly 4 feet tall, which sounds manageable until you're carrying it for 12 hours while someone shoots arrows at you. You quickly discover that poor maintenance could get you killed in ways both predictable and creative, since rusty hinges jam at crucial moments and snapped straps leave you defenseless when you need protection most. Weight and poor fit make the kit itself a chronic source of injury, while constant upkeep becomes mandatory and time-consuming work that nobody mentioned during recruitment. Chafing from ill-fitting armor creates wounds that never quite heal, turning your daily existence into a constant low-level torture session. The heavy chest band of your armor grinds into your sternum, potentially breaking the skin if you're not careful about how you move. Every step becomes a negotiation between forward progress and avoiding the spots where metal meets flesh in uncomfortable ways. You understand that Roman engineering prioritized function over comfort, and apparently your comfort wasn't even a consideration in the design process. The gear that's supposed to protect you becomes its own enemy, requiring constant attention just to remain bearable. But this is just the beginning of discovering what your body can endure, because now comes the part where they expect you to actually move in all this equipment. Training starts with what seems like reasonable marching, 20 miles in 5 hours at a brisk military pace of about 4 miles per hour, which sounds manageable until you actually try it while carrying just under 60 pounds of gear that wants to kill you. Your drill sergeant explains this cheerfully, like he's describing a pleasant afternoon stroll rather than a death march designed to separate the weak from the slightly less weak. Stage 1 involves learning to march in formation without tripping over your own feet or the guy next to you, which proves more difficult than expected when your sandals don't fit and your pack keeps shifting weight like it has a personal vendetta against your spine. You start to suspect the Romans invented this specifically to break your spirit before anyone even throws a sword at you. Stage 2 introduces combat training against wooden posts, where you beat practice targets with deliberately overweighted wooden swords until your arms feel like overcooked pasta. The wooden practice weapons are heavier than real ones, because Romans believed in making everything unnecessarily difficult. Your opponent is a post that doesn't fight back, yet somehow you still lose most encounters, while centurions critique your technique with vine sticks and creative insults. Stage 3 means pilum practice, throwing heavy training javelins fitted with leather tips to prevent serious injury during practice sessions. The training pila are weighted to build strength, which sounds reasonable until you realize you'll be throwing these things for hours while centurions shout corrections about your stance, your grip, and your general failure as a human being. Your shoulder socket files a formal complaint with your brain about this career change. Stage 4 requires vaulting exercises, jumping over obstacles while wearing full gear and carrying unsheathed swords, because apparently Romans believed in making simple tasks as difficult as possible. You're expected to leap over barriers that would challenge an unencumbered gymnast, except you're wearing armor that weighs more than some small children. Gravity becomes your personal enemy during these sessions, and poorly fitted armor reveals itself painfully during every fall. Stage 5 focuses on drill, where individual soldiers learn to move as a single organism responding to shouted commands or trumpet blasts. Drill follows drill, first on the parade ground and then in open country, until your unit moves like a machine at the slightest signal. Each recruit learns his place in formation, what to do if he ends up in the wrong place, and how to change from line to wedge or form defensive circles when everything goes wrong. The relentless schedule continues regardless of weather, injury, or your personal feelings about the whole situation, because Roman efficiency doesn't recognize human limitations as valid excuses. Rain makes everything heavier and slippery. Heat turns your armor into a portable oven. Snow makes footing treacherous during vaulting exercises. The training continues anyway, because centurions apparently don't believe in meteorology. This systematic process deliberately breaks down your civilian identity and rebuilds you as a military component that responds to orders without thinking. The training aims to make soldiers operate as a single organism, a painful process, but a military necessity that explains why the method persisted. By the end, you understand that you're no longer a person who happens to be a soldier. You're a soldier who used to be a person, and now you're about to discover exactly who has the authority to reshape what's left of your existence. That authority comes with a legal framework that makes modern workplace harassment look like gentle suggestions. You think you understand workplace hierarchy until you meet your centurion, who carries a vinewood staff called a vitis, and has the legal authority to administer corporal punishment for infractions, ranging from sloppy equipment maintenance to breathing too loudly during formation. The severity varies by offense, unit, and commander, but the power remains absolute. Roman military discipline operates on a spectrum from mildly unpleasant to death, with most punishments clustering around wish you were dead. The system covers everything from pay docking and extra duties to flogging and elaborate execution ceremonies. Because Romans believed in having options, centurions' behavior mattered enormously, and punishments could reflect local discretion, but the military also maintained formal categories of penalty for different offenses. Minor infractions earn you castigatio, beatings with vine sticks that leave you bruised, humiliated, and deeply regretting whatever you did wrong. These aren't gentle taps either. The centurion puts his back into it, and you're expected to stand there and take it without flinching. Complaining about unfair treatment just earns you another round, because apparently Romans hadn't invented the concept of constructive workplace feedback. Serious offenses can strip your rank, dock your pay, or transfer you to inferior units where the food is worse and the survival rates are questionable. Militiae mutatio means losing years of accumulated privileges and starting over with the newest recruits who smell worse than you do. Gradus diectio transfers you to units where experienced soldiers go to die slowly, usually involving more dangerous assignments and fewer resources. Collective punishments demonstrate how individual mistakes become everyone's problem. Fermentum mutatum switches your unit from wheat to barley rations, a demotion that affects both your social status and digestive system. Extramuros forces your unit to pitch tents outside the camp walls, excluding you from the only community you know. These penalties weren't just inconvenient, they were socially devastating. Animadversio fastium involves flogging that can permanently damage your back, carried out before your entire unit as educational entertainment. For the most serious crimes like falling asleep on night watch in hostile territory, fastuarium meant soldiers condemned after trial could be clubbed to death by their own comrades. The tribune would lightly tap the condemned with a staff, then your tent mates would finish the job. Decimation, where every 10th man in a disgraced unit was executed, had been used during the Republic but became rare in the professional imperial army. The last recorded instance was under Galba, making it more historical threat than daily reality. The centurion's vine stick becomes a symbol of absolute authority that can ruin your day, your career, or your life depending on the offense. You learn that survival means absolute obedience, not because you respect authority, but because the alternatives range from painful to fatal. This system methodically transforms individual citizens into military components, stripping away personal autonomy in service of something larger and more ruthless than any single soldier's comfort or survival. The system worked because it offered something civilians couldn't get elsewhere: steady pay, veterans' pensions, equivalent to about 14 years' salary, and the promise of land grants or citizenship upon discharge. For many recruits, 25 years of suffering represented their only path to social mobility and financial security. The Romans created a military machine so efficient that it conquered most of the known world, but that efficiency came at the cost of individual humanity. Every decision, from tent assignments to meal portions, was designed to strip away personal identity and rebuild you as a military component. Your thoughts, preferences, and physical comfort became irrelevant compared to the needs of the legion. Every aspect of legionary life was designed to transform free citizens into interchangeable components of an imperial war machine. The brutal training, communal living, terrible food, and harsh discipline weren't accidental features. They were deliberate choices made to break down civilian identity and create soldiers who would march 20 miles, sleep in the mud, eat hardtack, and die on command without question. So that recruiter's promise of steady pay, 3 meals a day, and job security? Technically accurate, just repackaged as a lifetime subscription to organized misery with excellent retirement benefits. Let me know in the comments which part of legionary life you'd least want to endure, and subscribe for more videos just like this. You're dying of plague in 17th century Europe when a 6-foot leather nightmare appears at your bedside. The creature has a massive bird beak jutting from its face, crystal eyes that reflect nothing but darkness, and carries a wooden stick like death's own walking cane. This isn't some medieval monster crawling from your fever dreams. It's your doctor. And somehow that makes it infinitely worse. The smell hits you first. A nauseating mix of rotting herbs, sharp vinegar, and the unmistakable stench of fear seeping through cracked leather. Your vision blurs, but you can still make out that grotesque silhouette looming over you. Everyone knows what this costume means. You're probably going to die, and this bizarre figure will be the last thing you see before the darkness takes you. But here's the twist that'll make your skin crawl. Everything you think you know about plague doctors is completely wrong. The iconic plague doctor costume that haunts our nightmares wasn't worn during the Black Death of 1347 to 1353. Not even close. This leather monstrosity was invented 300 years later, making it one of history's most persistent lies about medieval medicine. Charles de Lorme, physician to King Louis XIII, designed this walking nightmare in 1619 during a plague outbreak in Paris. The timing matters because by the 17th century, people were even more terrified and desperate for solutions than their medieval ancestors. The Black Death had become a terrifying legend, and when plague returned, Europeans wanted something, anything, that looked like protection against the invisible killer. Delorme's creation wasn't medical innovation. It was theater designed to make doctors look like they knew what they were doing. The problem was, most plague doctors weren't real doctors at all. They were undertrained volunteers, former fruit sellers, and second-rate physicians who couldn't make it in normal practice. Cities hired these medical rejects because actual qualified doctors either fled town at the first sign of plague or died trying to treat it, leaving desperate administrators scrambling for anyone willing to wear the cursed suit. The costume became a walking advertisement that screamed abandon hope. Even the doctors wearing it knew they were essentially useless. These weren't heroic healers risking their lives to save the sick. They were glorified death accountants, paid by cities to count corpses, record who died when, and make sure bodies got buried properly to prevent further spread. The hiring process was brutal in its honesty. Town administrators would negotiate with potential plague doctors like they were hiring someone for a suicide mission. In Turin, in 1630, officials desperately tried to secure Dr. Maletto's services, instructing their representatives to get the best deal possible, but warning them not to lose this opportunity because finding another person willing to do this job would be nearly impossible. The contracts tell the real story. In Pavia, Giovanni de Ventura's 16-clause agreement was amended multiple times, with pay reduced and obligations increased. The city basically told him he'd only treat plague patients. No other work allowed is less than -0 and his behavior would determine whether he'd receive full citizenship. It was a death sentence with paperwork. Most plague doctors died within weeks of starting the job. Pope Clement VI hired several extra plague doctors during the Black Death to tend to Avignon's sick, but of 18 doctors in Venice by 1348, only 1 remained alive. 5 had died of plague, and 12 had simply vanished, probably fleeing in terror. The costume wasn't medical equipment. It was a psychological weapon that terrified patients as much as the disease itself. When people saw that beaked figure approaching their homes, they knew death was coming. The doctors themselves became symbols of hopelessness, walking reminders that medicine had no answers for the plague's devastation. Cities treated these doctors like expendable resources. They paid them poorly, housed them in isolation, and expected them to die so that more valuable members of society, real doctors, administrators, clergy, wouldn't have to risk exposure. The plague doctor was medieval Europe's ultimate disposable worker, dressed up in leather and herbs to make the inevitable look slightly more professional. The great irony is that while the costume provided no real medical benefit, it accidentally offered some protection. The waxed leather kept fleas, the actual plague carriers, from reaching the doctor's skin, and the full body coverage prevented direct contact with infected fluids. But this was pure luck, not medical knowledge. By the time the costume disappeared in the 18th century, it had accomplished its real purpose, making death look organized and giving terrified populations the illusion that someone, somewhere, had a plan for fighting the unstoppable plague. Let's tear apart this leather nightmare piece by piece, because every element of the plague doctor costume was more ridiculous than the last. Starting with that infamous beak, the most recognizable and absurd part of the entire getup. The beak wasn't just for show. It was stuffed with aromatic herbs, dried flowers, crushed spices, and sometimes opium-soaked sponges. The theory behind this was miasma, the belief that disease spread through bad smells, so good smells would somehow protect you from infection. Think of it as medieval aromatherapy taken to its most extreme conclusion. Inside that leather nightmare, doctors crammed whatever smelled pleasant: lavender, peppermint, crushed roses, carnations, juniper berries, camphor, cloves, myrrh, and ambergris. Some even added vinegar-soaked sponges for extra protection against the evil air. The result was a nauseating cocktail of competing scents that probably made doctors dizzy before they even reached their patients. The beak measured roughly 6 inches long, half a foot of curved leather jutting from the doctor's face like some demented bird. It had 2 small holes near the nostrils for breathing, but these tiny openings meant doctors were essentially suffocating themselves while trying to filter air through rotting herbs. Imagine trying to breathe through a sock stuffed with potpourri while wearing a leather mask in summer heat. Those crystal or glass eyepieces looked impressive, but they fogged up constantly from the doctor's breath, leaving them essentially blind while treating patients. The glass would steam over within minutes, creating a condensation nightmare that made seeing anything clearly impossible. Doctors stumbled around like leather-clad zombies, poking at patients they could barely see through their fogged-up goggles. The full-body leather coat was the costume's centerpiece, a floor-length nightmare made from waxed linen, goatskin, or Moroccan leather. The material was sealed with oil or wax to prevent bad air from seeping through, but this created a walking sauna that trapped heat and moisture inside. Doctors essentially cooked themselves alive while trying to appear professional. The leather was chosen because people believed contagion couldn't stick to it as easily as other materials. Goatskin was considered superior to linen because of its smaller pores and polished texture. The reality was that doctors were wearing dead animal skins while treating people dying from disease, a level of irony that medieval minds couldn't grasp. That wide-brimmed leather hat served as a medieval hazmat warning sign, marking their profession so people could flee before the walking omen of death approached. The hat wasn't just identification, it was a public service announcement that screamed, "Plague Doctor coming, prepare for bad news." The wooden cane wasn't just for walking, it was a multi-purpose tool for poking patients, examining symptoms from a distance, removing clothing from plague victims, and keeping people at arm's length. Doctors used these sticks like medieval cattle prods, treating human beings like contaminated objects that couldn't be touched directly. The entire outfit weighed enough to make doctors move like arthritic scarecrows, adding to the supernatural dread they inspired. Picture a figure wrapped head to toe in heavy leather, stumbling blindly through plague-ridden streets while breathing through herb-stuffed tubes and poking at dying people with sticks. It looked less like medicine and more like some bizarre religious ritual. The gloves and boots completed the ensemble, made from the same thick leather and sealed with wax. Doctors' hands were essentially useless inside these crude mittens. They couldn't feel pulses, examine wounds properly, or perform any delicate medical procedures. The boots were so heavy and awkward that walking became a laborious process. The costume took forever to put on, and even longer to remove safely. Doctors needed assistance getting dressed, like knights preparing for battle, except their enemy was invisible and their armor was made from dead animals stuffed with flowers. The elaborate process of suiting up became a ritual that wasted precious time while patients died waiting for treatment. Once inside this leather prison, doctors discovered they couldn't eat, drink, or relieve themselves without a complicated undressing process. Many worked long shifts in unbearable conditions, dehydrated and exhausted, while the herbs in their beaks made them sneeze uncontrollably. The psychological effect was devastating. Patients saw this leather monster approaching and knew death was near. Even healthy people crossed streets to avoid encountering these walking symbols of doom. The costume's greatest achievement wasn't medical, it was accidentally preventing flea bites through its thick, waxed covering. The real plague carriers couldn't penetrate the leather barrier, providing some protection despite the doctor's complete ignorance about how plague actually spread. This ridiculous ensemble became medieval Europe's most expensive way to look professional, while accomplishing absolutely nothing. Every element designed to protect against disease was based on completely wrong theories about how sickness spread, creating a perfect storm of medieval medical incompetence, wrapped in expensive leather and stuffed with dead flowers. Now, let's talk about the actual treatments these leather-wrapped nightmares inflicted on their dying patients. If you thought the costume was bad, wait until you hear about plague doctor medicine, a collection of procedures so catastrophically wrong that patients often died from the cure faster than the disease. The most popular treatment was bloodletting, because nothing says medical expertise like draining blood from people already dying of blood poisoning. Plague doctors would slice open veins with filthy instruments, believing they were releasing corrupted humors from the body. The reality was they were weakening patients who desperately needed every drop of blood to fight the infection. Many plague victims bled to death on their sickbeds, while doctors nodded approvingly at their own medical brilliance. But bloodletting was just the opening act. The real horror show began when doctors decided to lance the buboes those swollen, infected lymph nodes that gave bubonic plague its name. Using the same unwashed knives they'd used on previous patients, doctors would slice open these pus-filled masses, creating open wounds that became superhighways for secondary infections. They believed draining the evil humors would cure the patient. Instead, they were spreading plague bacteria directly into open flesh, essentially speedrunning the dying process. The treatments got more bizarre from there. One popular remedy involved rubbing live frogs on the buboes, based on the theory that the cold amphibian would balance out the hot disease. Picture this. You're burning with fever, struggling to breathe, and some leather-clad monster starts rubbing a confused frog all over your infected lymph nodes. The frogs, naturally, died from the experience, which doctors took as proof that the treatment was working. The frog had absorbed the disease's evil essence. For wealthier patients, doctors prescribed drinking ground unicorn horn mixed with wine. This miracle cure was actually powdered narwhal tusk or rhinoceros horn, basically expensive chalk, that did absolutely nothing except empty purses. The fact that unicorns didn't exist seemed to escape everyone's notice. Desperate families bankrupted themselves buying mythical creature parts while their loved ones died anyway. Doctors also burned aromatic herbs directly in patients' rooms, creating choking clouds of smoke that made breathing even harder for people already struggling with respiratory symptoms. They'd set fire to rosemary, thyme, and juniper, filling cramped sick rooms with thick, acrid smoke. Patients with pneumonic plague, the lung infection version, literally suffocated on the cure meant to purify their air. Some treatments ventured into pure fantasy. Doctors prescribed wearing amulets made from specific combinations of metals, believing that copper and silver could draw poison from the body. They'd hang heavy medallions around the necks of people too weak to lift their heads, adding physical discomfort to their medical torment. The obsession with balancing humors led to treatments that defied basic logic. Since plague was considered a hot disease, doctors would pack patients in ice or snow, inducing hypothermia in people whose bodies were already failing. Others prescribed massive doses of laxatives to purge the corrupt matter from patients' bowels, dehydrating plague victims who desperately needed fluids. Mercury was another favorite cure, because apparently poisoning patients with heavy metals seemed like sound medical practice. Doctors would rub mercury ointments on buboes or force patients to swallow mercury pills, adding mercury poisoning to their list of medical problems. The metal's toxic effects, tremors, kidney failure, brain damage, were interpreted as signs that the treatment was working. Prayer was often the most honest treatment plague doctors offered, though even this came with a price tag. Many doctors doubled as spiritual advisors, charging families for deathbed consultations and last rites preparation. At least when they told patients to pray, they weren't actively making things worse. The most common cure was actually preparing for death. Doctors spent more time taking patients' final wills and testaments than attempting any actual healing. They'd arrive at bedsides with legal documents instead of medicine, treating dying people like paperwork to be processed rather than lives to be saved. Many patients died from the treatments faster than they would have from plague alone. The combination of blood loss, infected wounds, mercury poisoning, and smoke inhalation created a perfect storm of medical malpractice. Families watched their loved ones suffer through torturous procedures that accomplished nothing except prolonging agony. The doctor's main job wasn't healing. It was maintaining the illusion that someone was in charge of the crisis. They recorded deaths for city records, ensured proper burial procedures, and provided a visible symbol that authorities were taking action. Their medical knowledge was irrelevant. Their real function was bureaucratic. Some plague doctors were honest about their limitations. Raimundo Chalmel de Venario, physician to the Avignon papacy, recognized that bloodletting was ineffective and admitted that all true cases of plague were incurable. He continued prescribing bleeding for members of the Roman Curia, but only because he disliked them. At least his medical incompetence had some personal satisfaction. The treatments reflected medieval medicine's fundamental misunderstanding of disease. Every procedure was based on the theory that illness came from imbalanced humors or corrupted air, leading to interventions that attacked symptoms while ignoring causes. Doctors were fighting an imaginary enemy with weapons that harmed their own patients. The tragic irony was that doing nothing would have been more effective than most plague doctor treatments. Patients who received basic comfort care, clean water, rest, and pain relief is less than H0 had better survival rates than those subjected to the full arsenal of medieval medical torture. This wasn't medicine. It was ritualized suffering designed to make families feel like everything possible was being done while their loved ones died from a combination of plague and medical malpractice. Being a plague doctor wasn't just dangerous. It was medieval Europe's most miserable profession, a job so terrible that most practitioners died within weeks of putting on the leather suit. The mortality rate was staggering. Most plague doctors survived less than a month after starting work, making it history's shortest career path. They'd sign their contracts, don the cursed costume, and promptly join the death tolls they were supposed to be recording. Cities went through plague doctors like disposable tissues, constantly hiring replacements for positions that were essentially death sentences with paperwork. The pay was insulting considering the risk. Towns treated plague doctors like sacrificial civil servants, offering just enough money to attract desperate volunteers while expecting them to die so real doctors wouldn't have to. The contracts were brutal in their honesty. Cities would negotiate payment terms knowing full well they probably wouldn't have to honor them for long. Life inside the leather suit was pure torture. The costume was suffocatingly hot, trapping body heat and creating a walking sauna that left doctors drenched in sweat within minutes. The herbs stuffed in their beaks made them sneeze constantly, while the tiny breathing holes meant they were perpetually short of breath. The fogged eyepieces left them half blind, stumbling through plague-ridden streets like leather-wrapped zombies. They couldn't touch patients, couldn't see properly, and couldn't breathe fresh air, making any kind of meaningful diagnosis impossible. The thick gloves prevented them from feeling pulses or examining wounds, while the heavy boots made walking a laborious process. They were essentially medical scarecrows, dressed up to look professional, while being completely ineffective. Even their families avoided them. The costume made plague doctors walking symbols of death, forcing them to live in complete isolation until they inevitably caught the plague themselves. Children would scream and run when they saw the beaked figures approaching. Healthy people crossed streets to avoid encountering these leather-wrapped omens of doom. Cities often hired them knowing they were sending people to their deaths. The position existed to protect more valuable members of society, real doctors, administrators, clergy, from having to risk exposure. Plague doctors were expendable resources, dressed up in expensive leather to make their sacrifice look slightly more dignified. The psychological toll was devastating. These men knew they were walking dead, counting down days until the plague claimed them too. They watched patient after patient die despite their treatments, knowing their presence brought terror rather than hope. The costume that was supposed to protect them became a prison that isolated them from all human contact. Their legacy isn't medical advancement but pure terror. The plague doctor costume became the walking embodiment of humanity's helplessness against disease, inspiring the Grim Reaper imagery we still recognize today. They represented a moment when medicine admitted defeat and dressed up its failure in leather and herbs. The plague doctor died as he lived, alone, terrified, and completely useless against the invisible enemy that had already won. Picture a perfect pearl. Not just any pearl, but one of those impossibly round, lustrous spheres that catches candlelight in a Parisian salon. It sits nestled against the pale throat of a duchess, worth more than most people will see in a lifetime. The weight of it speaks to power, to refinement, to a world where beauty has been distilled into something so pure it seems almost divine. In 1850, a single perfect pearl could buy you a house in London. It was the ultimate luxury, the final word in elegance. Now, let me tell you where that pearl actually came from. 60 feet below the surface of the Persian Gulf, in water so dark you can't see your own hands, a man is dying. His lungs are screaming for air, his eardrums feel like they're about to burst, and his fingers are bleeding from the razor-sharp oyster shells he's frantically tearing from the seabed. He's got maybe 10 seconds before his body forces him to surface, and in those 10 seconds, he needs to collect enough shells to justify this dive. Because he'll do this again and again. 30, maybe 40 times today, every day for the next 5 months. This is pearl diving in the 18th and 19th centuries, and if you think you could handle it, you're wrong. There are 2 things that will kill you out there, and they're both guaranteed. First is the diving itself, the pure, relentless physical punishment of forcing your body to do something it was never designed to do. Your lungs will betray you, your blood will turn against you, and the ocean will find every weakness you have. Second is the debt, because even if your body somehow survives the diving, the system is designed to trap you. The boat captains, the pearl merchants, the entire economic machine, it's all built to keep you diving until you can't anymore. And when you can't dive, you die broke. Here's everything a pearl diver carried into the depths. A bone clip to pinch his nostrils shut, leather guards to protect his fingers from the shells, a heavy stone tied to a rope, and that's it. No mask, no breathing apparatus, no wetsuit. Just flesh and bone against the crushing weight of 60 feet of water. The technique was brutally simple. You'd hyperventilate on the surface, filling your lungs with as much air as possible while your tender, called a siyub, held the lifeline. Then you'd grab that stone, take one final breath, and drop like a rock toward the bottom. The descent was the easy part. Gravity and that stone would pull you down in seconds, the pressure building in your ears until it felt like someone was driving nails into your skull. The water temperature dropped as you sank, and by the time you hit the seabed, the cold had already started seeping into your bones. Then the real work began. You had maybe 30 seconds, 40 if you were exceptional, to scramble across the ocean floor in near total darkness. Your hands would search desperately for the telltale rough texture of oyster shells, ripping them free from rocks and coral, stuffing them into a small basket or net. Every second counted because your lungs were already burning, your body already screaming for you to surface. This wasn't graceful underwater exploration. This was a panicked, desperate transaction between your body and the sea. You were trading pieces of your life for the chance that one of these shells might contain something valuable. The pressure at 60 feet is nearly 3 times what your body experiences on land. Your ribcage compresses, your heart works harder, and nitrogen from the air you breathe starts dissolving into your blood. But you can't think about any of that because you're too busy trying not to drown. When your lungs finally gave you no choice, you'd drop everything except the shells and yank on that lifeline. Your tender would haul you up as fast as possible, and you'd break the surface gasping, coughing up seawater, your vision spotted with black dots from oxygen deprivation. Then you'd rest for maybe 2 minutes, just long enough for your heart rate to settle, before doing it all over again. The most skilled divers could stay down for 3, maybe 4 minutes. But that was rare, and it came at a cost. Your body wasn't designed for this kind of punishment, and it would find ways to make you pay for every dive. The question wasn't whether you'd be injured, it was how badly and how soon. Now imagine doing this not once, not 10 times, but 30 to 40 times every single 6 days a week for 5 straight months. The pearl diving season ran from June through October, when the Persian Gulf turned into a furnace. Surface temperatures hit 120 degrees, but that was nothing compared to what waited below. The water might feel cool at first, but after your 10th dive of the morning, your body temperature would start dropping. By your 20th dive, you'd be shivering uncontrollably between descents. By your 30th, hypothermia would be setting in despite the blazing sun overhead. Your eyes took the worst beating. The salt water was so concentrated it turned your conjunctiva into sandpaper. After the first week, most divers developed a condition they called pearl eye, a painful inflammation that made everything look like you were staring through frosted glass. Many went temporarily blind, their eyes so swollen they couldn't open them. But you kept diving anyway, navigating by touch alone, because stopping meant losing money you couldn't afford to lose. The constant pressure changes destroyed your eardrums. Every dive was like taking a hammer to the side of your head. Blood would trickle from your ears by midday, and the pain became so constant you learned to ignore it. Veteran divers often went partially deaf, their eardrums scarred and perforated from years of abuse. But the real torture was the visibility. 60 feet down, the Persian Gulf was like diving into black ink. You couldn't see the shells you were grabbing, couldn't see the coral you were scraping against, couldn't see the predators circling just beyond arm's reach. Everything was done by feel. Rough oyster shells, sharp coral edges, the occasional brush of something large and alive moving past you in the darkness. The cuts were endless. Oyster shells have edges like broken glass, and when you're frantically grabbing them in near-zero visibility, your hands get shredded. The salt water kept the wounds from healing properly, so they'd reopen with every dive. Your fingers would be raw meat by the end of the first week, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth you could find, but you kept using them because you had no choice. And then there were the sharks. They were always there, drawn by the blood and the commotion. Usually they kept their distance, but tired divers bleeding from multiple cuts made tempting targets. The smart divers carried knives, but when you're 60 feet down with failing lungs and your hands full of shells, you're not exactly in fighting condition. Most attacks happened during the ascent, when divers were most vulnerable. The coral was almost worse than the sharks. The Persian Gulf floor was carpeted with razor-sharp formations that could slice you open without warning. In the darkness, you'd crawl across them, feeling your way from one oyster bed to another, leaving skin and blood on every surface. The cuts got infected in the warm, bacteria-rich water, turning into festering sores that never properly healed. Sleep became impossible. Your body was too damaged, too exhausted, too racked with pain to rest properly. You'd lie on the deck of the boat, salt-crusted and shivering, listening to the groans and cries of the other divers. Some men wept in their sleep, others just stared at the stars, knowing they'd have to do it all again when the sun came up. The worst part was the knowledge that this was just the beginning. June was the easy month. By August, when the heat was at its peak and your body was already broken down, the diving got harder. The good oyster beds near the surface had been picked clean, so you had to go deeper, stay down longer, take bigger risks for smaller rewards. But the diving itself wasn't what killed most pearl divers. The real killer was something they couldn't see, couldn't fight, and didn't understand until it was too late. The bends, what doctors now call decompression sickness, was a death sentence delivered in slow motion. Every time you dove deep and came up fast, nitrogen from the compressed air in your lungs dissolved into your bloodstream. When you surfaced too quickly, that nitrogen formed bubbles in your blood and tissues, like opening a shaken bottle of champagne. The divers had their own names for the symptoms. The creeps was the unbearable itching that started in your skin and worked its way deeper. It felt like insects crawling under your flesh, and scratching only made it worse. The staggers was the dizziness and confusion that made you stumble around the deck like a drunk man. But the worst was the bends itself. Joint pain so severe it doubled you over. Your knees, elbows, and shoulders would seize up with agony that felt like someone was driving hot spikes through your bones. The pain was so intense that grown men would scream and beg for death, and it could last for days. The lucky ones just suffered and recovered. The unlucky ones faced permanent paralysis as nitrogen bubbles blocked blood flow to their spinal cords. Others suffered brain damage when bubbles reached their skulls, leaving them confused, forgetful, unable to speak properly. Some went blind. Others lost the use of their limbs entirely. There was no treatment, no cure, no relief, except time and prayer. The divers would lie writhing on deck while their shipmates kept working, because the season waited for no one. If you couldn't dive, you didn't eat. If you couldn't work, you were left behind. But even worse than the physical destruction was the economic trap that kept men diving long after their bodies had given out. The system was designed around debt, and debt was designed around desperation. The boat captains, called Nakuda, controlled everything. They owned the boats, the equipment, the rights to the diving grounds. More importantly, they controlled the money. During the off-season, when there was no work and no income, divers had to borrow money for food, for shelter, for their family's survival. The Nakuda were happy to lend, at crushing interest rates. When the diving season started, your first obligation wasn't to yourself or your family, it was to your debt. Every shell you brought up, every pearl you found, went first to paying what you owed. And somehow, no matter how hard you worked, the debt never seemed to shrink. There were always new expenses, new charges, new reasons why you owed more than you'd earned. The system was perfectly designed to trap you, work yourself to death and die in debt, refuse to work and starve in debt. There was no way out except down, into the black water, grabbing for shells that might contain your salvation, but would more likely contain your doom. The story of pearl diving doesn't begin in the Persian Gulf. It begins thousands of miles away, along the coasts of East Africa, where the world's most skilled divers had been perfecting these techniques for generations. When European colonizers arrived in the Americas, they found Native Americans wearing pearls in abundance. Freshwater pearls from rivers like the Ohio and Mississippi, marine pearls from Caribbean waters. But the Europeans quickly realized they needed more than just the pearls. They needed the people who knew how to get them. Enter the African aquanauts. These weren't random laborers pressed into service. They were master divers, trained from childhood in the art of breath-hold diving, capable of staying underwater longer and diving deeper than anyone else in the Atlantic world. Their expertise had been developed over centuries along the African coast, passed down through generations of fishing communities who understood the ocean in ways that Europeans never could. The Spanish were the first to recognize their value. When they discovered the massive pearl beds off the coasts of Venezuela and Colombia in the early 1500s, they immediately began importing African divers. These men could dive to depths that killed other workers, could hold their breath for times that seemed impossible, could navigate underwater terrain with a skill that bordered on supernatural. But skill came with a price that had nothing to do with money. The Spanish worked their African divers to death with the same systematic brutality they applied everywhere else. The diving conditions in the Caribbean were arguably worse than the Persian Gulf, the shark-infested waters, deeper beds, longer seasons. The mortality rate was staggering, yet the pearls kept flowing. Entire fleets carried nothing but pearls from the Americas back to Europe, where they adorned the necks of queens and the crowns of kings. The Spanish called the New World the Land of Pearls, and for good reason. The wealth extracted from those underwater oyster beds helped fund an empire. The African divers weren't just victims in this system. Many were entrepreneurs within the constraints of their bondage. The most skilled could sometimes negotiate better conditions, even earn wages alongside their enslavement. Some managed to buy their freedom and that of their families through their diving expertise. But for every success story, there were dozens of men who simply disappeared beneath the waves. Their bodies never recovered, their names never recorded. The same skills that made African divers invaluable in the Americas also made them prized in the Persian Gulf. The techniques were identical: breath-hold diving, rapid descent, frantic collection, desperate ascent. The dangers were the same, the economic exploitation was the same, only the geography changed. This was the world's first truly global luxury economy, built entirely on human suffering. Pearls flowed from the Persian Gulf to the markets of Bombay, from the Caribbean to the palaces of Madrid, from the rivers of North America to the jewelry shops of Paris. Every perfect sphere represented hours of agony, months of debt, years of shortened lives. The pearl merchants understood the mathematics perfectly. A single exceptional pearl could be worth more than a diver would earn in his entire lifetime. The profit margins were so enormous that losing divers to death or disability was simply a cost of doing business. There were always more desperate men willing to risk everything for the chance of survival, but the entire system was built on a foundation that couldn't last forever. In the early 1900s, a Japanese entrepreneur named Mikimoto perfected the art of cultured pearls. Suddenly, you didn't need men to dive for pearls. You could grow them in controlled conditions, harvest them safely, produce them in quantities that made natural pearls obsolete almost overnight. The collapse was swift and total. Within a few decades, the pearl diving industry that had existed for thousands of years simply vanished. The boats were abandoned, the diving grounds forgotten, the skills that had been passed down through generations became useless overnight. So, here's what strikes me about the whole thing. A pearl is nothing more than a mollusk's response to irritation. A grain of sand gets inside a shell, and the oyster coats it, layer by layer, until it becomes something beautiful. It's a defense mechanism. Really. The creature is trying to protect itself from something that's hurting it. Humans looked at that process and decided it was worth dying for, worth enslaving people for, worth building entire economies around. We took something that was essentially an oyster's way of dealing with pain and turned it into the ultimate symbol of luxury and beauty. There's something almost perfect about that irony. The pearl itself is born from suffering, the oyster's suffering. And then humans created infinitely more suffering to possess it. Layer upon layer of human misery wrapped around that original grain of irritation until you have something so beautiful that people forgot entirely what it cost to create. The next time you see a pearl, remember that. Remember the men who died in the dark water, 60 feet down, their lungs screaming for air. Remember the African divers whose skills were stolen along with their freedom. Remember the debt that trapped generations in a cycle of desperation. That perfect, lustrous sphere sitting in a jewelry store window isn't just beautiful. It's a monument to human greed and human endurance, to the things we'll do for beauty and the things we'll do for survival. It's a reminder that luxury has always had a price, and that price has always been paid by someone else. The pearl diving industry is gone now, killed by technology and progress. But the pearls remain, as perfect and beautiful as ever, carrying their secrets in silence. You're looking at pine trees that appear to have been designed by someone who'd never seen a pine tree before. These aren't your typical straight-backed conifers standing at attention like green soldiers. These trees twist, spiral, and loop back on themselves like nature decided to try calligraphy with timber. Some curl into perfect rings. Others bend so dramatically they touch the ground before deciding to grow upward again. It's as if someone planted a forest and the trees responded by staging the world's slowest interpretive dance performance. The government wanted orderly rows of pines to hold down some sand dunes. Instead, they got what looks like a Dr. Seuss fever dream made of bark and needles. Back in the early 1960s, Soviet planners had what seemed like a straightforward problem. The Curonian Spit, a narrow strip of sand dunes stretching between Lithuania and Russia, was unstable. Sand kept shifting, threatening roads and settlements. The solution appeared obvious. Plant pine trees. Trees have roots. Roots hold sand. Problem solved. The bureaucrats selected their location carefully on Kruglaya Dune, ordered their saplings, and set their workers to planting neat rows of Scots pines. These weren't exotic specimens or experimental hybrids, just regular pine trees doing what pine trees do best, growing straight up toward the sun while anchoring soil with their roots. Except that's not what happened. Within a few years, it became clear that these particular pines had missed the memo about growing straight. Instead of the expected orderly forest, officials found themselves staring at what looked like a botanical rebellion. Trees spiraled into corkscrews, others formed loops and rings. Some bent at impossible angles before correcting course and growing upward again. A few seemed to be attempting to tie themselves in knots. The really puzzling part was the selectivity of this arboreal anarchy. Not every tree in the area decided to join the dance. Plenty of pines in the same forest grew perfectly normally, standing straight and tall like proper trees should. The twisted ones clustered in specific patches, as if they'd formed some kind of union and agreed to collectively ignore basic plant biology. This wasn't gradual warping over decades. The trees grew crooked from the start, their trunks developing those characteristic curves and spirals during their early years. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the dancing forest had already earned its name. The locals, displaying the kind of practical humor you'd expect from people living on a contested strip of sand between two countries, started calling it the drunken forest. The Curonian Spit itself has always been a place where normal rules seem suspended. This narrow peninsula stretches for 60 miles, sometimes only a few hundred yards wide, caught between the Baltic Sea and the Curonian Lagoon. It's a landscape built from migrating sand dunes, some reaching heights of 200 feet. The entire spit shifts and changes with storms and seasons. A reminder that solid ground isn't always as solid as it appears. For centuries, this strip of land has been passed between German, Soviet, and Lithuanian control, like an unwanted houseguest. Before the war, the exact spot where the twisted trees now grow hosted a Nazi gliding school, where young Germans learned to soar above the dunes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that a place once dedicated to flight now featured trees that couldn't manage to grow in a straight line. The forest covers about 1 square kilometer, small enough that you can walk through the entire twisted section in an hour. But those few hundred acres contain enough botanical impossibilities to keep scientists scratching their heads for decades. Some trees form perfect spirals, their trunks corkscrewing skyward like wooden DNA helixes. Others create loops and arches, growing in circles before remembering they're supposed to reach for sunlight. The most dramatic specimens bend so far, they nearly touch the ground before curving back up, creating natural archways that tourists love to photograph. A few have grown into shapes that look almost deliberate, as if someone spent years training them like living sculptures. The locals joke that you can find tree rings that will grant wishes if you climb through them, though they're probably just being polite to the tourists who travel thousands of miles to see trees that forgot how to be trees. When confronted with trees that appear to have attended a yoga class taught by Salvador Dali, scientists did what scientists do. They started theorizing. The results have been about as twisted as the trees themselves. The leading scientific explanation involves the pine shoot moth, specifically Rhiasionia booleana, a small caterpillar that supposedly damages the growing tips of young pine trees. According to this theory, the caterpillars munch on the apical buds, forcing the trees to grow from their side shoots instead. Since plants naturally grow toward light, the damaged trees eventually correct their course and grow upward again, but with their deformities permanently fixed in place. It's a tidy explanation that sounds reasonable until you start asking inconvenient questions. Like why these particular caterpillars decided to attack trees in such specific, artistic patterns, or why the moth damage would create such consistent spiral formations rather than random bent shapes. The theory also struggles to explain why only certain areas of the forest were affected while nearby trees remained perfectly straight. Either these caterpillars had very specific aesthetic preferences, or something else was at work. The wind theory attempts to blame the Baltic's notorious storms for sculpting the trees into their current shapes. Strong, consistent winds could theoretically bend young trees, and the Curonian Spit certainly gets its share of weather. But wind damage typically creates trees that lean uniformly in one direction, not the spirals, loops, and corkscrews found in the dancing forest. You'd also expect to see similar formations throughout the windy Baltic region, yet this particular type of tree twisting seems remarkably localized. Some researchers point to the unstable sandy soil as the culprit. The idea is that shifting sands cause the trees' root systems to move, forcing the trunks to bend and twist as they try to maintain their balance. This theory has the advantage of being conveniently vague and difficult to disprove, which makes it popular among scientists who prefer their explanations to sound authoritative while avoiding specifics. The magnetic field hypothesis represents the point where scientific theories start sounding like science fiction. Proponents suggest that unusual magnetic fields in the area interfere with the tree's growth patterns, somehow confusing their natural tendency to grow straight. The problem is that magnetic fields strong enough to bend trees would probably affect a lot more than just pine growth, and there's no evidence of such anomalies in the area. Human manipulation theories propose that people deliberately shape the trees, perhaps for artistic purposes or to create furniture-quality curved wood. This would explain the seemingly intentional patterns, but it raises practical questions about who would spend decades secretly training trees to dance and why they choose this particular remote location for their arboreal art project. Each expert who studies the dancing forest seems to develop their own pet theory, usually involving some combination of insects, weather, soil conditions, and human interference. The explanations grow more elaborate with each passing year, as if the complexity of the theories could somehow match the complexity of the phenomenon they're trying to explain. What's particularly striking is how defensive these explanations sound, as if the scientists themselves aren't entirely convinced by their own reasoning. They use phrases like most likely caused by and probably due to, with the frequency of people who've spent too much time staring at impossible trees and not enough time finding satisfying answers. The truth is that none of these theories fully explains why dozens of trees in one small area decided to grow like living pretzels, while their neighbors remained boringly vertical. The dancing forest continues to twist in ways that make perfect sense to the trees themselves, but leave human observers grasping for explanations that feel increasingly inadequate. Perhaps the most honest assessment comes from researchers who admit they're not entirely sure what's happening, but they're confident it's probably natural. It's the kind of scientific conclusion that satisfies no one, but at least has the virtue of acknowledging the limits of human understanding when confronted with trees that refuse to follow the rules. Before Soviet planners decided to plant their rebellious pines, this particular patch of sand had already witnessed enough drama to traumatize several generations of trees. The exact spot where the twisted forest now grows once hosted a Nazi gliding school, where young German pilots learned to soar above the dunes in the years before World War II. There's something darkly poetic about a place once dedicated to flight, now featuring trees that can't manage basic vertical growth. The Curonian Spit has always been contested territory, passed between empires like a geographic hot potato. Germans controlled it for centuries, followed by Soviets, then Russians again, with Lithuanians claiming their portion, and everyone arguing about borders drawn through shifting sand. The local population has been displaced, replaced, and displaced again so many times that the land itself seems to have developed an identity crisis. During the war, this narrow peninsula became a strategic corridor, with military installations scattered along its length. Soldiers from multiple armies marched across these dunes, leaving behind bunkers, ammunition, and the kind of lingering unease that comes with places where young men died far from home. The gliding school was abandoned when its students were called to more deadly forms of flight, and the buildings slowly disappeared under the ever-shifting sand. After the war, Soviet authorities inherited a landscape scarred by conflict and marked by the ghosts of its German past. They renamed towns, relocated populations, and tried to erase the previous cultural identity of the region. The decision to plant stabilizing forests was partly practical and partly symbolic, an attempt to literally put down roots in territory that had changed hands so many times that even the maps couldn't keep up. But perhaps land remembers things that people prefer to forget. The soil beneath those twisted pines contains layers of history written in artillery shells and aircraft parts, in the bones of soldiers and the foundations of abandoned buildings. When you dig deep enough in the dancing forest, you find metal fragments and brick pieces, remnants of structures that once stood where trees now spiral skyward in apparent distress. Local residents, those few who remained through the various occupations and deportations, speak of the area with a mixture of familiarity and unease. They've watched the forest grow for decades, seen the trees twist into their impossible shapes, and developed their own theories about why normal growth patterns seem to fail in this particular location. Most involve the idea that traumatized land produces traumatized trees, a notion that sounds unscientific until you consider the alternative explanations. The concept of psychogeography suggests that places retain emotional imprints from significant events, influencing everything that happens there afterward. While mainstream science dismisses such ideas as folklore, The dancing forest makes you wonder if trees might be more sensitive to their environment's history than we assume. After all, these pines are growing in soil that has absorbed decades of human conflict, their roots spreading through earth that has witnessed more upheaval than most places experience in centuries. There's also the matter of the land's fundamental instability. The Curonian spit is built from migrating sand dunes, constantly reshaped by wind and water. Nothing stays in one place for long, including the ground itself. Roads built one decade disappear under dunes the next. Buildings require constant maintenance to avoid being swallowed by shifting sand. Perhaps trees growing in such an unstable foundation develop their own coping mechanisms, bending and twisting to accommodate a landscape that refuses to stay put. The irony runs deeper when you consider that this place of twisted growth once trained people to fly straight and true. The gliding school represented German engineering precision, teaching students to harness wind currents and navigate by landmarks that are now buried under decades of sand. Those same winds that once lifted gliders now blow through a forest where trees grow in spirals, as if the land itself has forgotten how to aim for the sky. While scientists develop increasingly complex theories about caterpillars and magnetic fields, the locals have settled on explanations that are both simpler and more mysterious. According to regional folklore, the dancing forest exists at a convergence point where positive and negative energies clash, creating a supernatural battleground that manifests in twisted wood and bent reality. The most persistent legend tells of ancient spirits who inhabit the forest, beings that predate human settlement and view the planted pines as unwelcome intruders. These spirits supposedly manipulate the tree's growth as a form of ongoing protest, twisting them into shapes that serve as warnings to anyone who might consider further development. The trees aren't dancing for joy, according to this version, but writhing in supernatural discomfort. Local tradition holds that climbing through one of the tree rings will add a year to your life or grant a wish, depending on which version of the story you hear. Tourists regularly attempt this feat, squeezing through loops and arches, while locals watch with the patient amusement of people who've seen this particular superstition played out thousands of times. Whether the wishes come true is a matter of perspective, but the tradition persists with the stubborn logic of folklore that refuses to be disproven. The older residents, those who remember the forest from its early years, speak of hearing sounds among the twisted trees that don't quite match normal forest noise. Not exactly music, but not exactly wind either. Something rhythmic and deliberate, as if the trees are indeed dancing to music only they can hear. These accounts are dismissed by visitors who attribute such stories to overactive imaginations and too much local vodka, but they're told with the consistency of people describing something they've genuinely experienced. Another version of the local folklore suggests that the forest follows the movement of the underlying sand dunes, twisting and bending as the ground shifts beneath it. This explanation has the advantage of sounding almost scientific while maintaining its mystical edge. The trees aren't just growing strangely, they're responding to the landscape's own restless movement, dancing in slow motion to the rhythm of geological change. The name Drunken Forest reflects the locals' practical approach to inexplicable phenomena. Rather than demanding scientific explanations or supernatural justification, they simply observe that the trees look like they've had too much to drink and leave it at that. It's the kind of regional humor that comes from living in a place where the ground shifts, borders change, and trees grow sideways without asking permission. What's particularly striking about the local folklore is its comfort with mystery. Unlike the scientists who feel compelled to explain every twisted branch, the residents seem perfectly content to accept that some things happen without clear reasons. They've lived through enough unexplained upheavals, political and natural, to develop a philosophical acceptance of phenomena that resist easy categorization. The folklore serves another purpose beyond entertainment. It provides a framework for understanding a place that defies normal expectations. When your local forest looks like it's been designed by someone having a particularly vivid dream, traditional explanations about soil conditions and insect damage feel inadequate. Stories about dancing spirits and energy convergences might not be scientifically accurate, but they capture something essential about the experience of walking among trees that seem to have forgotten the basic rules of being trees. After decades of research, dozens of theories, and countless attempts to explain why trees in one small forest decided to grow like wooden pretzels, we're left with a conclusion that might disappoint anyone hoping for definitive answers. Nobody really knows. The pine shoot moth theory has holes. The wind explanation doesn't hold up. Soil instability sounds plausible until you examine the specifics. Magnetic fields venture into science fiction territory. Human manipulation requires believing in a decades-long conspiracy of secret tree trainers. Even the folklore, honest as it is about embracing mystery, offers more poetry than proof. Perhaps that's exactly as it should be. In an age when satellites can photograph your breakfast and sensors can detect earthquakes before they happen, there's something oddly comforting about trees that continue to baffle experts. The dancing forest serves as a reminder that the natural world still holds secrets, still produces phenomena that resist our need to categorize and explain everything we encounter. The trees continue their slow-motion performance, spiraling and looping without regard for scientific theories or tourist expectations. They've been dancing for over 60 years now, outlasting multiple research expeditions and countless attempts at explanation. They'll probably keep dancing long after we've given up trying to understand why. Maybe the real mystery isn't why the trees grow in impossible shapes, but why we're so desperate to explain everything. Some questions might be more interesting than their answers. Sleep well knowing that somewhere in Russia, trees are still refusing to follow instructions, and nobody can do anything about it.